we're going to start by talking about who draws what districts, when, and under what authority. And we're going to specifically focus on Texas here. So in Texas, the state government draws congressional districts. They draw the state legislative districts, that is the House and the Senate in Texas. They draw the state board of education districts, and in rare circumstances, they draw the judiciary districts. Those are your district courts. Local governments, your county commissioners, your city elected officials will draw your county commissioner districts, your city council districts. Their school districts will draw your school district trustee districts. And then there are local precinct lines. All of those redistricting processes at the local level happen after the redistricting that happens at the state level. So you all know lots and lots of people talk about the redistricting that takes place for the legislative districts or the congressional seats. And we currently have 36 congressional seats. However, it is estimated that we're likely to get 2 more due to population growth. So we will likely end up with 38 congressional seats. It also impacts 181 legislative seats, 15 state board of educations, 507 judicial districts, and a plethora of local districts. There is more at stake, though, than just your legislative districts. Redistricting is also the way that the federal government apportions money at the federal level. So for the state of Texas, there is $101.6 billion at stake in redistricting. And so the census, which we just completed, and hopefully that everybody on this call participated in, was so important because for every 1% of undercount for the census, Texas has an estimated potential loss of almost $3 billion in federal funds coming back to Texas. And so the majority of those funds, about $71 billion, goes to Medicare and Medicaid. These are our Medicaid matching dollars. So the state puts in and the federal government puts in. And so 71 billion of that is just in those 2 programs. The other $30.4 billion goes to 312 other programs. I think Julie said that your mission is the lost, the lonely, I can't remember the neglected. I can't remember what other L word she used for her beautiful alliteration, but these are your programs that you're interested in. These are your school lunch programs. These are your affordable housing programs, your SNAP benefits, which is your food benefits for people who are in the poverty levels, your rural telecommunication infrastructure, wildfire grants, crime victim assistance, homeless prevention assistance, and more. So these dollars are incredibly important. So next, redistricting authority. So I've broken this down so that you can see the authorities in the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Texas. The U.S. Constitution grants all state legislatures the authority to draw their congressional districts. This is important. It rests solely with the legislature. The legislature cannot give that authority to somebody else. Whereas the state legislature districts and the state board of education and the state judiciary are the authorities defined by the Texas Constitution with parameters set up by the U.S. Constitution. So the state legislative districts can be drawn by the Texas legislature, but if they fail, there's also a legislative redistricting board that comes into process if the legislature does not pass a map which is signed by the governor. This is also different from the congressional districts because the state legislative, the state board of education, and the state judiciary have timelines when they can be adopted. So Congress, the congressional districts, which are drawn only by the state legislature, can be drawn at any time during the biennium or any time at any other biennium, anytime during the decennial process, actually. However, they have to be drawn at the beginning so that you have well-apportioned districts for the next election, but they can be redone anytime throughout that decennial. The state legislature, the Texas Constitution says that the the first regular session after the census numbers come out, then that's when you do redistricting. And if the legislature fails to adopt maps, or if they adopt maps that the governor fails to approve, then the Legislative Redistricting Board has a certain time frame to do that. There is no provision in the Texas Constitution for what happens if the U.S. Census numbers don't come in the appropriate amount of time during that first regular session, which is a situation we may find ourselves in this time. There's also no provisions for a special session, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The State Board of Education does not have to be done at a regular session, and the judiciary, if not. So as I was saying, there is no language in the Texas Constitution for what happens if the census numbers are given to us late, or if they're needed to be done after a regular session and beyond the time frame that is set in the Constitution for the Texas Redistricting Board. So I'm going to go ahead and ask to have this slide changed to the next one. What is the Legislative Redistricting Board? The Texas Legislative Redistricting Board is set up in statute. It is made up of 4 statewide elected officials and the Speaker of the House. The 4 statewide elected officials are the Lieutenant Governor, the Attorney General, the Comptroller, and the General Land Office Commissioner. This is Dan Patrick, Ken Paxton, Glenn Hager, and George P. Bush. The Speaker of the House is not a statewide elected official, but is elected among the members of the House. He is a state representative like all others and is chosen among his colleagues to lead the chamber, but one of his constitutional duties is to serve on the Texas Legislative Redistricting Board. The 4 statewide members were elected not this election cycle, but 2 years ago. And so the majority of the Legislative Redistricting Board was already set a couple of years ago. These individuals have 90 days to meet from the time that a map fails to pass in the Texas legislature, or once a governor vetoes a map, and they have 60 days to complete their work. If we can go to the next slide. The next slide, I've pulled up for you when the Legislative Redistricting Board usually comes into action. In 1981, we had a Democratic legislature and a Republican governor. The legislature did pass maps, but the governor vetoed them. At the time, there were no constitutional timelines for the Legislative Redistricting Board, so they didn't meet until August. And they continued to meet through October, which, as you can imagine, for anyone trying to prepare ballots or try and to arrange what district they're going to run in, this was very troubling for people and caused multiple problems on down the line. So after that, the legislature adopted timelines for the Legislative Redistricting Board. In 1991, however, it wasn't needed because there was a Democrat legislature and there was a Democrat governor. And so there were maps that were passed and there were maps that were signed by the governor and went into effect. In 2001, you had a divided legislature and you had a Republican governor. The divided legislature failed to pass maps. And so the Legislative Redistricting Board adopted maps in June and July, which went into effect. But remember, the Legislative Redistricting Board cannot, under the U.S. Constitution, draw congressional maps. And so in September, a U.S. federal court adopted congressional maps in Balderas v. Perry. They adopted these maps and put them into effect by November 2001, but the 78th legislature came back and adopted new congressional maps in 2003. In 2011, the session that I was involved in, we had a overwhelmingly Republican legislature and a Republican governor. We passed the State Board of Education maps, the House and the Senate maps in the regular session, and then we passed congressional maps in an immediately called special session. Next slide, please. So the normal timeline for this, as you can see on the left, we have January running all the way through December of this year. Normally, the legislature would meet for 140 days from January until May, which they are currently doing. The census numbers would come out somewhere in February. So I'm clear we had numbers that came out in December before session in 2011, which gave each state its total population. But the numbers that we needed for the intra-state drawing of maps, which is the number of people in each household on each block, did not arrive to Texas until about February. They actually have until April normally to deliver these numbers, but the U.S. Census Bureau tries to deliver those numbers early to the states that they know have constitutional deadlines. The governor then has 30 days to veto any bills, and the legislative redistricting maps is a filed bill just like any other bill. And then the legislature may have a 30-day session. At the same time, you're also seeing the institution of the Texas Legislative Redistricting Board if the legislature failed or the governor vetoed a redistricting map. Now at the bottom, you can see the timelines for when the local governments start to draw their districts and the filing for precinct chairs and the filing for primary candidates. There are federal regulations for when ballots need to go out to overseas military, which is really the controlling deadline for when our election clerks need to start drafting their ballots. And in order to draft ballots, you need to have precincts. And in order to have precincts, you need to have legislative districts. So it is a very, very tight time frame. Next slide, please. This is the worst case possible COVID impact schedule for 2021. As everyone knows, the U.S. Census Bureau was stymied in their ability to go house to house because of the distancing regulations to keep those individuals safe. And plus, I don't know about y'all, I didn't want to answer the door for anybody coming to my house. It is possible that the numbers that the state needs to draw their in-state maps will not be arriving until late July or early August. That throws everything off as far as the Texas constitutional deadlines, because the Texas Constitution says that you need to draw maps in the first regular session, which will have already passed. However, you can't have districts that are malapportioned and allow people to run in them. For number one, we're likely to get 2 additional congressional seats. They need to go someplace. People need to run in them. But also, you don't want to have people being represented in a district which has a huge number of population being equal to a district which may have lost all of its population. We do have huge migrations from West Texas into what we call the Golden Triangle, from Dallas to San Antonio over to Houston and back up. That Golden Triangle is where a lot of the population is now moving. 80% of the state's population now lives in that Golden Triangle. So even though there's no Texas constitutional provision for drawing maps for a legislature in a special session, most of the conversation up at the Texas Capitol is that there will be a special session in August to draw these maps. They're going to get sued either way. If they left the maps as they were, they would get sued for having malapportioned districts. If they try to draw them in a special session, somebody is likely to sue them because they weren't drawn in a regular session. Next slide, please. Redistricting principles. So these are the legal guidelines on how to draw a map. Next slide. So we're going to start off with the Voting Rights Act, because lots of people talk about the Voting Rights Act without a lot of people really understanding what the specific provisions are. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is where we get the non-discrimination requirements of the federal law, which says that a racial or language minority group has to be allowed to elect the candidate of their choice, and you cannot dilute their ability to elect their candidate of choice in any way. Now, the problem with Section 2 is that this is the section which requires preclearance, which means that when we draw a map, we had to file them with the Department of Justice, the Obama Department of Justice, or filed them in a federal court asking for preclearance. There was a lawsuit at the federal level in 2011, the Shelby decision, which said that the formula by which the federal law applied this preclearance requirement to states and to local districts was outdated. And so while the preclearance requirement is still there, they can't apply it until Congress comes up with a new formula. And Congress has yet to do that. And so Texas is no longer required to have its maps pre-cleared. When you have your maps pre-cleared, the burden of proof in court is on the state to prove that they did not discriminate. Without preclearance, the burden of proof now rests on any plaintiff suing the state to say that there was discrimination. Section 4 of the Voting Rights Law says that if somebody was in preclearance, they can request to get out, a bailout. Conversely, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act says if you have been bailed out or you are not in preclearance requirements, as Texas no longer is, then somebody can sue to bail you back in, to claw you back in to preclearance based on discrimination. We are likely to see clawback litigation after this session by plaintiffs wanting to put Texas back into preclearance. So even though you may have heard that Texas is no longer required to be pre-cleared, we are likely to see this issue litigated shortly after maps are adopted. Next slide, please. Legal requirements and permissible goals. You have to maintain equal population. The 14th Amendment of the US Constitution says that you have an equal protection under the law, which means that your vote should count just as much as your neighbors or somebody in West Texas or somebody in East Texas or South Texas. And so your districts have to be equal. Congressional districts must be as equal as practicable, which means that every single district has to have the exact same number of people except for maybe one that may have one or two over. When we drew our maps in 2011, there was one district which had one additional person. Legislative districts are allowed to have a deviation, a 9.9 or a 10% deviation from the ideal population. Now, that isn't necessarily every single district gets a 10% deviation, and so we'll talk about that here in a minute. You do need to respect traditional redistricting principles. Districts have to be compact. They have to be contiguous. They have to preserve communities of interest. And this is where you are going to probably be interested in if you're going to want to testify. A community of interest could be a town. It could be a neighborhood. It could be a religious area. Like there are neighborhoods of Jewish communities, which that is considered a community of interest. There could be a community of interest where there is a pocket of a single minority, which is clustered together in a neighborhood. That would be a community of interest. It is important to note that the Voting Rights Act does not recognize coalitions of minorities, just single minority majorities. Next, preserving political subdivisions. Those are your counties, your towns, your precincts. Preserve natural or other geographical boundaries. When people talk about the fact that they are in one district, but their neighbor across the street is in a different district, and how strange that seems, it's because the natural geographical boundary is down that street. You are required to preserve the core of the previous district. You are required to protect incumbents, or you can be allowed to protect incumbents. And you are allowed to have political goals, to draw a more Republican or a more Democratic map. That is a legally permissible goal. In the Texas Constitution, specifically for the House map, there is a requirement that we call it the county line rule, which says that if you can draw a district inside a county line, then you have to. And the purpose is so that a county's representation is not diluted. What that ends up happening, though, is sometimes you have what's called in redistricting a drop-in county. And what that means is that every single district inside that county can be drawn within the 10% deviation without crossing the county line. And so therefore, that county line becomes a barrier, it becomes protected. Can I have the next slide, please? So this map is an estimation. Sorry, no, I'm sorry. This is what the 2010, I'm sorry?
Oh, I was just going to make sure you know you're on the one that's the 2010 drop-in counties.
Yes, thank you. So this map is the districts, the counties which were drop-in counties in 2010, 2011 redistricting. And so these are the counties which all of the districts are drawn inside that county. And the reason they're called drop-in districts is when my staff in the redistricting committee were drawing districts, they could literally draw the entire state of Texas and go around those counties and it not impact the map at all. And so what they would do is they would go to the county delegations and say, you draw your county and bring it to us and we will drop it into the map. And we actually had the majority of our drop-in counties do that. Nueces, Bexar, El Paso, Williamson and Travis, and Tarrant County and Denton County all brought us maps that we dropped into the map with the signatures of every single legislator who was serving in those counties. Dallas and Harris County, their delegations could not agree on what those maps should look like, and so the staff actually drew them. And when you're drawing these things, you have to protect the minority-majority districts that were protected there previously, as long as the population's still there to support that protection. Next slide, please. Legal prohibitions. As I've mentioned before, you cannot impinge on minority voters' rights to elect the candidates of their choice. Based on the U.S. Constitution, the 14th Amendment of Equal Rights, the 15th Amendment, which prohibits the abridgment or denial of vote because of race, the Voting Rights Act, which we've talked about. Then in Thornberry v. Jingles, that's a redistricting case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, were some of the things that we talked about before about cohesiveness and contiguity, your geography, a cohesive minority. These last two, cohesive minority and a racially polarized voting. These are the things that you need to start thinking about if you're going to give testimony. So a cohesive minority, again, is one minority. The Voting Rights Act, there's no precedent for a protection of coalitions, a mixture of Hispanic and Black or Asian and Hispanic. It has to be a single minority for protection under the Voting Rights Act. And you have to have a group that, even if they are a minority, they vote together, that they have the same concerns, that they have the same political goals, that they want to elect the same candidate. Sometimes you have minorities that are of different parties and they don't want the same thing, and so they're not a cohesive minority. So you have to be able to prove up that not only do you have a large minority population, but they vote the same. Racially polarized voting. So what we're talking about here is what I was just talking about, where you might have a single race, but they vote differently. And so you can't consider them a cohesive minority. You cannot racially gerrymander. So districts drawn for racial purposes require strict scrutiny for compliance. This is a higher level under a court scrutiny when they're looking at the maps. So do not crack minority populations and do not pack minority populations. What that means is kind of exactly what it sounds like. If you have a district and you pack a whole bunch of minorities in it to try and not have that influence in the surrounding districts, then you are packing minority population into a single district. However, if you crack that population, that same exact population into multiple districts, then you're cracking that minority population so that they can't elect the candidate of their choice. Now, sometimes, especially like in the State Board of Education districts, which have huge geographical areas, people were talking about how we might have packed a minority population into one, but you have to look at the minority population in the surrounding districts and whether or not they're able to elect the candidate of their choice. Just because a district along the South Texas border may have a 70% minority population doesn't mean that you've packed minority population in there if the population in the surrounding districts also have high minority population and are able to elect the candidate of their choice. Go on to the next slide. So I'm about ready to show you some different slides with specific numbers in them, and I want you to understand that the data on these slides are based on the U.S. Census Bureau's 2019 one-year American Community Survey. So in between the decennial censuses, the U.S. Census Bureau does these surveys of population, and it's an extrapolation. It's not an actual head count. So it is a guideline for where we think we are, but it is not 100% accurate. They have 1 year American community surveys, and then they have a rolling 5-year where they continue to improve that data. And so this is based on the 1 year American Community Survey from 2019. So it is the least accurate between the 1 year and the 5 year, but it is also the latest data. And so I'm trying to have the latest data here for you, but it is not the possible high mark data. It's also, so you know, the American Community Survey, the smallest unit of data that they have is a county level. And so I can't do anything smaller than a county. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about the ideal population. Based on the 2019 American Community Survey, the ideal population for a House district is 193,000 people, 306. A congressional district in Texas is, well, everywhere, is 754,574. The ideal population for a Senate district in Texas is 935,531, and a State Board of Education ideal population is 1,933,059. So in the House districts, the Senate districts, and the State Board of Education, the courts will allow a 10% deviation from that ideal. The congressional districts, remember, are as little deviation as is practicable. Now, that ideal population, that does not mean that every single senator, every single state representative, every single State Board of Education member gets to say, oh, well, I have a 10% deviation from that ideal. What that means is there's a 10% deviation from the smallest district to the largest district. So the smallest district could be 10% smaller than the ideal population, and that largest district may be right on the ideal. Or it could slide to where the smallest district is right on that ideal population and the largest district is 10% higher. And so it's a sliding scale, and it is dependent upon every single other district. So no district gets to look at themselves independently. So to get an idea of the growth in the state of Texas, next slide, please. These are our current maps for our districts: congressional, state Senate, state House, and the State Board of Education. And I've given you the ideal population in 2011 and the ideal population in 2021. You can see Congress has grown almost 60,000 people. In the Senate, it has grown 115,000. The State Board of Education has grown 300,000, And the House districts have grown by almost 30,000 as well. And so when you start thinking about that, in districts where they have lost population, so West Texas, those districts are going to have to grow geographically to be able to consume more population. In the Golden Triangle, where we have a concentration of population, a growth of population, those districts are going to shrink. So it's kind of counterintuitive. If your district has, your city has grown, your districts are going to get smaller. And so you can kind of understand where, as the districts grow out, they might encompass a fellow incumbent. So the state Senate districts, if you look out in West Texas, there's not a lot of room to expand without gathering up somebody you might currently serve with. Conversely, in the urban areas, if your district shrinks, it leaves population that is not represented, which means that you have new districts that go in there. Those new district numbers come from areas where there have been two incumbents who have been paired. Next slide, please. So how do you get involved in redistricting? As I said, a redistricting map is a bill just like any other, and it has to go through the process. A Senate bill, House bill is filed, the lieutenant governor and the speaker send it to a jurisdictional committee, a redistricting committee. From there, it gets passed to the Senate floor, into a calendars committee, and then off to the House floor. If then they pass their originating chamber and they go to the other chamber and has to go through the same process all over again. If the two chambers pass differing legislation, then they go to a conference committee where the two parties, the two chambers work out the differences, and then ultimately they go to the governor to work it out. If you want to be involved, then you need to be involved in talking to not only your state representative or your state senator, but also to the committees who are really going to be the people who are going to draw these maps. Your state senator, your state Senate Redistricting Committee is chaired by Senator Joan Huffman. The Redistricting Committee in the House has not been named yet. We just have a brand new speaker, and he has not yet named committees. I would not forget, though, there is a possibility legally that maps could go to the Legislative Redistricting Board, because the legislature seems to be thinking they're going to completely bypass the Texas Legislative Redistricting Board for a special session, but I don't know how that might work out in the courts. So I would not forget to send comments to your comptroller, to your attorney general, and to your general land commissioner, as well as the lieutenant governor and the speaker and the redistricting committees. So I have a slide next that you guys do not have. And I have added this slide, and I'm sorry you can't see it. The Senate Redistricting Committee has decided to already start hearings starting tomorrow. They're regional hearings, but you can testify at any of their hearings, but they do have regional focuses. You can testify virtually, or you can just log on to watch. The senators will be in Austin, but they will be taking virtual testimony. The login information for the hearings can be found at the Texas Legislature online on the Senate Committee of Redistricting's meeting page. They have meetings scheduled starting tomorrow, January 25th at 9 a.m., running through that week, the following week, and then the week after that. And so January 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, February 2nd, February 3rd, February 4th, February 12th, 19th, and then the 26th and the 27th. Tomorrow, they're going to start off with West Texas, move to South Texas, go to North Texas, Central Texas, East Texas, then move on to specific cities: Brownsville, Harlingen, McAllen, San Antonio, DFW, Houston, El Paso, Austin, and then all regions. All of these postings and the login information can be found. You just have to Google Texas Legislature online and then find the Senate Committee Redistricting page, and the hearings are all posted on their page. Next slide, please. Redistricting resources. Other information that I'm giving you are links to the U.S. Census Bureau's newsroom, where they will announce when these numbers are being released. The Texas Legislative Redistricting website. This has information that you can find the maps, you can find reports that have what zip codes are in what districts, what school districts are in what districts. You can find out the history and the litigation history of all of the Texas redistricting, not just in the past decennial, but for decades and decades past. The Texas Comptroller, a member of the Texas Legislative Redistricting Board, also has a Redistricting 101 on his website. I've given you a link for that. The Brennan Center is a national think tank, and it lobbies on gerrymandering and fair representation. They have a wonderful center, which if there is litigation in Texas, you can just go onto their website and you can do a search for Texas redistricting, and it will pull up the various litigation, and you can go to each individual case website, and it will have all of the filings, so you can read every single filing as soon as they're available. The last website I've given you is the National Council of State Legislators Redistricting page. If you're curious about more than just Texas, this website has every single state's redistricting process on this page.